I drove the whole way with the radio off. That's how I knew it was bad. I always have something playing, old country, classic rock, doesn't matter. That morning I couldn't stand any of it. Just the hum of the highway and the sick feeling in my chest that hadn't let up since my niece called me at 2:47 in the morning and said 4 words before the line went dead. "Uncle Ned, please come." That was it. No explanation. No background noise. Just those 4 words and then nothing. I'd tried calling back 6 times before I even got my boots on. Straight to voicemail every time. Her name on my phone screen. Addie. In that little camera photo I'd taken of her at Thanksgiving 2 years ago, grinning with cranberry sauce on her chin. She was 26 in that photo. She looked like her mother. She always looked like her mother. I live outside of Knoxville. Addie and her husband lived up near Asheville, about 2 hours east. I was on the road by 3:15. I didn't call my brother first. He's got a heart condition, and I wasn't about to wake him up at 3 in the morning with something I didn't understand yet. I told myself I'd call him once I knew what I was dealing with. I told myself a lot of things on that drive to keep from going 90 miles an hour on a dark Tennessee highway. I found her sitting on the front porch steps of a neighbor's house 4 doors down from her own. She was in a nightgown and 1 slipper. The other foot was bare. She had a quilt wrapped around her shoulders that didn't belong to her, and her left wrist was in some kind of makeshift wrap, a dish towel folded twice and held with a rubber band. The porch light was on. The woman who lived there, who I later learned was named Mrs. Patton, was sitting beside her in a lawn chair with a mug of something hot, not saying anything, just sitting there with her. When my headlight swept the porch, Addie stood up. The quilt fell off one shoulder. She looked at me the way a person looks when they've been waiting for the only person they trust. I got out of the truck before I'd fully stopped it. She didn't cry right away. That was the thing that scared me most. She just walked to me and put her face against my chest and stood there while I held her, and her breathing was this shallow, controlled thing, like she was concentrating on it, like crying was a luxury she hadn't figured out how to afford yet. I thanked Mrs. Patton. She handed me the quilt and said, quiet and steady, "You get her somewhere safe now." The way she said it, not get her to a hospital or call the police, just somewhere safe, told me she understood something about the situation that I was still catching up on. I put Addie in the passenger seat. I turned the heat on even though it was May. She was shaking. "Can you tell me what happened?" I said. She looked straight ahead out the windshield at the dark street. "My wrist," she said. "I don't think it's broken. I caught myself on the banister." "What were you catching yourself from?" She didn't answer that. "Addie." "He pushed me," she said. "He didn't mean." She stopped herself, started again. "He pushed me on the stairs." I sat with that for a second. I kept my voice even. I've had some practice at that. "Where is he now?" "Inside. He doesn't know I left." "And his mother?" There was a pause, a long one. "She was there," Addie said. "She was in the kitchen when it happened. She watched and she didn't. She just stood there and she said," Addie's voice broke, just slightly, like a hairline fracture. "She said I brought it on myself. She said a woman like me should know better than to talk back in her son's house." A woman like me. I asked her what that meant. She turned her head away toward the window. It took her a long time to say it. "She's never thought I was good enough for him. From the beginning, my family didn't have money. My daddy worked maintenance for the county. Hers were old Asheville, old money. The kind of people who have their name on a building at the university. She told Declan, before they got married, that those were her words, beneath the family's expectations. He told me about it like it was funny, like it was his mother, just being his mother. Declan? I'd met him 4 times. Handsome kid, good manners when he wanted to use them. I'd never been able to put my finger on what bothered me about him, but something always did. He smiled at the right times and said the right things, and there was never quite enough behind his eyes when he did it. I drove Addie to an urgent care in Weaverville. Her wrist was sprained, not broken, but they wrapped it properly and gave her something for the pain. While she was getting that seen to, I stepped outside and called my brother. He picked up on the second ring. It was almost 6 in the morning by then. Gus has always been an early riser. "It's Ned," I said. "I need you to sit down." He said he was already sitting. That's Gus, 71 years old, 2 stents, and the steadiest man I've ever known. I told him what I knew. He listened without interrupting. When I finished, there was a silence, and then he said, "Is she safe right now?" "She's safe." "Then I'll be in my truck in 10 minutes. Send me the address." That's the thing about family, the real kind. Addie and I talked for a long time in the car after urgent care. Not all at once. It came out in pieces over the next few hours, the way bad things usually do, like a stain working its way through a shirt. You think you've seen all of it, and then there's more. She'd met Declan 4 years ago. She was working as a dental hygienist in Asheville. He was in commercial real estate, dealt with some of the same office buildings his family's firm managed. He was charming and persistent, and she was 24 and he was 30, and it felt, she said, like being chosen. The first 18 months were fine. Not perfect, she could see that now, but fine. His mother, Loretta, was cool toward her from the start, but never openly hostile. There were comments, little ones. "Oh, Addie, you must find our neighborhood so different from where you grew up. Or Declan tells me you didn't finish your degree. That's all right, not everyone's cut out for it." The kind of remarks that sting, but don't leave a mark you can point to. They got married in the spring of the 3rd year. Small ceremony. Addie had wanted her family there, all of them, her cousins and her aunt and her grandmother, who drove up from Georgia. Loretta had a problem with the head count. There were comments about the guest list getting unbalanced. Addie cut 6 people from her side to keep the peace. That was the first thing shad door. Was the nok atas lid shad on the first lid shad? After the wedding, they moved into a house that Loretta had technically bought. Declan's name was on the deed, but his mother had put in the down payment, and she made sure everyone knew it. She had a key. She didn't call before she came. She had opinions about the curtains, the kitchen, the way Addie organized the pantry. Declan told Addie his mother was just trying to help. He said it like it was obvious, like Addie was the one being unreasonable. Then Addie got pregnant. This was 14 months ago. She hadn't told me. I wish she had told me, but I understood why she hadn't. Things were already strained, and I think she was hoping that a baby might soften Loretta, might make her feel like Addie was permanent, was real family. Some people are softened by grandchildren. Loretta was not one of them. Loretta told Declan that they needed to think carefully about whether this was the right time. She said Addie wasn't financially stable in her own right. She'd cut back her hours at the dental office and was only working part-time. She said bringing a baby into an unstable situation wasn't fair to the child. She framed all of it as concern. She was very good at framing things as concern. What she actually did, what I didn't find out until later, was talk to Declan privately about the family trust. I need to explain this part because it matters. Declan stood to inherit a significant share of his family's estate when his father, Merritt, fully retired from the firm. Merritt was 68 and had been talking about stepping back for 2 years. The trust had conditions, standard old money stuff, the kind a family lawyer draws up specifically to keep certain people out and certain people in. One of the conditions was a vague clause about family continuity that Loretta had apparently convinced Merritt to include when Declan first started dating Addie. The language was fuzzy enough to mean whatever Loretta wanted it to mean. She used it. She told Declan that if the marriage continued in its current trajectory, There were members of the family's board, cousins, mostly people who'd never liked Declan much anyway, who would push to have his share reduced. She painted it as protecting him. She said she was trying to preserve what was his. And Declan, who had grown up wealthy and had no real concept of what it meant to not have that floor under him, believed her. Or maybe he wanted to believe her. I've thought about that a lot. Addie lost the baby at 11 weeks. She said it was a miscarriage. She grieved it the way you grieve those things, privately, quietly, trying not to take up too much space with her pain. It was only later, when she found certain items in a kitchen cabinet that had been shifted to the back behind Declan's protein powder, that she started to wonder. She didn't tell me about that discovery right away either. She told me about it on the second day, sitting at my kitchen table in Knoxville with both hands wrapped around a mug of coffee, in that quiet voice people use when they're not sure they believe their own words yet. She'd found 2 empty pill bottles. No labels, they'd been removed. But she'd taken pictures of them on her phone before putting them back, and she'd looked up the bottle shape and manufacturer code. One of them matched a medication known to interfere with early pregnancy. I stayed very still when she told me that. "You took pictures," I said. Yes. Do you still have them?" She nodded. "Don't delete them," I said. "Don't tell Declan you found them. Don't tell anyone yet." I excused myself and walked out to the back porch. It was a warm evening. The neighbor's dog was barking somewhere down the hill. I stood there for a few minutes just breathing, watching the light go orange over the ridge before I trusted myself to go back inside. By the time Gus arrived the next morning, I'd already started making a list, not written down. I've never been much for writing things down, but organized in my head the way I'd learned to organize things over 30 years working insurance fraud investigation. You look at what you have, you figure out what you need, you move quietly. Gus sat down with Addie and listened to all of it again. He didn't react the way I had, with that controlled stillness that's really just rage wearing a necktie. Gus cried. He held his daughter's hand across the table and he cried without any embarrassment at all, and I think that meant more to her than anything I'd done. Then he looked at me over her head, and he gave me a nod that I've known since we were boys, the kind that doesn't need any words to go with it. I called a friend of mine from my fraud work days, a woman named Casita, who'd retired from the Tennessee Bureau of Investigation 3 years ago. I trusted her absolutely. I laid it out for her, the medication bottles, the photos, the timeline, the trust, the financial pressure. She was quiet for a moment. "Ned," she said, "if what you're describing is what it looks like, you're not talking about a bad marriage. You're talking about potential criminal interference with a pregnancy." I know. Tennessee Code Annotated 39-130-107. Fetal homicide. It depends on circumstances and gestational age, but yeah, that's not a civil matter. "I need to know what evidence she needs before she goes to anyone official," I said. "I don't want her walking into a police station with 2 blurry photos and having it go nowhere." Cressida talked me through it. The photos were a start, but not enough. We needed documentation of purchase, pharmacy records, online orders, anything that put those specific pills in Declan's or Loretta's hands. We needed the physical bottles if possible, and ideally, a pattern of behavior. Financial coercion, physical abuse, the kind of documented history that turns a suspicious incident into a prosecutable case. Addie hadn't gone back to the house. She wasn't going to. We had her phone, her car keys, her ID. What she didn't have was access to any of the financial accounts, because when they married, Declan had suggested, gently, reasonably, that it would be simpler for him to manage the household finances. He made more money. He was better with numbers. She'd agreed. She'd agreed to a lot of things that seemed reasonable in the moment. The joint account had her name on it, but she hadn't logged in over a year. She tried from my kitchen table. Her login credentials had been changed. That one was important. That one was not an accident. I drove back up to Asheville alone 3 days later. I didn't go to the house. I went to the dental office where Addie had worked, where she still technically worked, and I spoke with her office manager, a woman who'd known Addie for 3 years. She told me Addie had been pressured to reduce her hours. She told me Declan had called the office twice in the past year, asking questions about Addie's schedule, her co-workers, whether she ever stayed late. She told me that about 8 months ago, Addie had shown up with bruising on her upper arm that she'd explained away as a fall. The office manager had photographed it. She'd done it quietly with Addie's knowledge because she'd been worried and she didn't know what else to do. She gave me a copy. I also paid a visit to a family law attorney in Asheville, recommended by Cressida. I sat across from a woman named, I'll just call her the attorney. She preferred her privacy in this later, and I laid everything on the table. The photos of the pill bottles, the office manager's documentation, the financial lockout, the sprained wrist from a push down the stairs with a witness who'd watched it happen. The attorney looked at everything carefully. The medication evidence alone, she said, is not going to result in a criminal charge today, but combined with the financial control pattern, the physical incident, and the documented isolation behaviors, you have a very strong foundation. You file for protective order first. You preserve every piece of digital evidence, and then you take the pregnancy question to the DA's office and let them investigate properly. What about the mother? I said. Loretta. If she was present for the physical incident, she's a witness at minimum. If she had any involvement in the medication, procuring it, facilitating it, she's potentially an accessory. That's for the investigators to determine. Is there any civil exposure on the trust, the financial pressure they used? She studied me for a moment. You've done this kind of work before. Different context, I said. Same principle. She smiled, just slightly, yes. If Declan used the threat of inheritance loss to coerce specific decisions from your niece, decisions related to her health or reproductive choices, there's a tortious interference argument and potentially a coercion angle. It's novel territory, but it's not nothing. What for still? I drove back to Knoxville that evening. Addie was on my couch, watching television with my cat on her lap. I have an old orange tabby who adopts grieving people like a therapy program. And when I came in, she looked at my face and I watched the fear flicker across hers. What did you find? She said. I sat down in the armchair across from her. I told her everything. She sat with it. Then she said, I want to do this right. I don't want to be the person who just runs away and lets them pretend nothing happened. You won't be, I said. 3 weeks later, Addie filed for a protective order with the documentation we'd assembled. The motion was granted within 48 hours, based on the physical incident and the witness statement from Mrs. Betley Patton, who turned out to be a retired school teacher with 30 years in the Asheville community and absolutely no patience for men who pushed women downstairs. The same week, Addie's attorney sent a formal demand to Declan's family firm regarding the locked joint account. The financial lockout was reversed within 72 hours. The amount in that account was less than it should have been, significantly less, which triggered its own separate inquiry. The medication question took longer. Cressida had a contact at the Buncombe County Sheriff's Office who agreed to look at the photos informally first before anything was official. They determined the bottle type matched a compound pharmacy order. That order was traceable. The pharmacy had records. The records had a name on them. It was Loretta's name. She had ordered the medication under a pretense Addie never knew about and would rather not have detailed here. What matters is the chain of evidence, and the chain held. The DA's office opened an investigation 7 weeks after Addie left that house in her nightgown and one slipper. Declan was served while standing in his office in front of 2 junior colleagues and his father's long-tenured administrative assistant, a woman who had known him since he was 12 years old and who I was told watched the whole thing without changing her expression at all. Loretta was served at a charity luncheon. I didn't plan that timing. Her attorney later implied that we had. We hadn't. Some things just work out the way they should. The trust question became moot in a way nobody had anticipated. Merritt, Declan's father, had apparently been kept out of most of what Loretta had been doing. When the investigation details became available to him through the civil discovery process, he didn't contest them. He amended the trust. Declan's share was reduced, not because of Loretta's manipulation, but because Merritt made that choice himself, quietly, without fanfare, and I have a small amount of respect for him for it. Not a lot, but some. Declan pled to a reduced charge, the physical incident, documented and witnessed. The pregnancy investigation resulted in charges against Loretta, specifically. That case is ongoing as I write this, and I won't say more than that for legal reasons. What I will say is that the evidence is solid and the attorneys on Addie's side are competent and thorough and not the kind of people who let things go quietly. Addie's back in Knoxville now. She's been living 20 minutes from me for 6 months. She went back to work full-time, different practice, closer to home, a dentist she'd known from her training program who called herself when she heard Addie was looking. She adopted a dog, a beagle mix named something ridiculous that I can't remember right now, who has made it her personal mission to destroy every throw pillow in Addie's apartment. She's dating someone, a guy she knew in college who reached out when he heard she'd moved back to the area. He's a high school track coach, grows tomatoes in his backyard, drives a truck that's older than mine. The first time I met him, he shook my hand and looked me in the eye and asked genuinely how I was doing. And then he actually listened to the answer. That's enough sometimes. That's more than you'd think. My brother Gus had a procedure in February, not his heart, something minor, outpatient. And Addie drove him there and back and sat in the waiting room the whole time. When I called to check in, Gus picked up sounding more like himself than he had in 2 years. Later, he told me that while they'd waited, he and Addie had talked for 2 hours about her grandmother, his mother, who died when Addie was small. He said she'd wanted to know everything. I thought about that on my drive home that evening, about who teaches us and who we carry forward. My father used to say that the only real thing a person owns is their name, not a building with it on the side, not a trust fund, not a legacy that gets curated by someone else after you're gone, just the thing you actually are, day after day, to the people who have no reason to lie to you about it. Addie owns her name. She always did. It just took a while for the people who'd been trying to obscure it to get out of the way. I still drive with the radio off sometimes, not because something's wrong, just because I got used to the quiet, and sometimes the quiet is enough. I keep coming back to that porch, Mrs. Patton sitting in the lawn chair at 3 in the morning with a mug of something hot, not saying a word, just being there. She didn't know Addie. She owed her nothing. She just saw a young woman who needed somewhere to sit and she opened her door. I've thought about that more than almost anything else in this whole story. There's a version of this where nobody opens that door, where Addie stands in the street in one slipper and the cold and eventually goes back inside because she has nowhere else to go. I've thought about that version too, and it doesn't sit well with me. What I've come to believe, and I'm 63 years old, so I've had some time to work this out, is that the way things end up is almost never random. Loretta spent years building something she thought was a fortress. Control over her son's money, control over who he married, control over what children they'd have and when. She was smart about it, patient. She used legal instruments and social pressure and the quiet weapon of making a person feel small until they start to believe it themselves. That takes a certain kind of intelligence, I suppose, but intelligence without a conscience isn't wisdom. It's just a sharper tool for doing damage. What undid her wasn't luck. It was the accumulation of every person she dismissed along the way. Mrs. Patton, who she'd never have noticed. Addie's office manager, who she didn't know existed. Cressida, who'd spent 30 years learning exactly how paper trails work. Every person Loretta had looked past because they didn't fit her idea of power. Those were exactly the people who built the case against her. Addie's part in this is what I'm most proud of, and I mean that carefully. She was scared. She'd been scared for a long time. But when I told her what we had, she didn't ask me to make it go away quietly. She said she wanted to do it right. That takes something that I think people underestimate. Not courage in the dramatic sense, not the kind you see in movies, but the steadier kind. The kind that gets up in the morning and says, I'm going to tell the truth about what happened to me, even though it's hard and slow and nobody's guaranteed to believe me. That kind of strength doesn't announce itself. It just keeps showing up. Gus cried at the kitchen table and I held it together, and people might think that makes him the softer one. I don't see it that way. Gus understood something in that moment that I was still processing through my jaw being clenched. He understood that Addie needed to be grieved over first, before anything else. Before the strategy, before the phone calls, before the list in my head. She needed someone to sit with her in the full weight of what had been done and not rush her out of it. He was right, and I've told him so since. What I want people to take from this, if they take anything, is that none of what happened to Addie was her fault, and none of what followed was magic. It was people choosing, at each small moment, to do the right thing, to keep a photograph, to answer a phone at 6 in the morning, to sit in a waiting room for 2 hours and ask an old man about his mother. That's how it actually works, not in dramatic gestures, but in quiet choices made by people who decided their character was worth keeping. Addie owns her name. She always did.